The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Leading up to the U.S. election on November 6, many commentators had predicted that young people wouldn't turn out to vote like they did in 2008. And yet, as it turns out, those between ages 18 and 29 actually turned out in greater numbers than they did 4 years ago. In 2008, the youth vote made up 18% of the electorate, and this year it bumped up to 19%. Now, by this point, all the pundits have combed through all the exit poll data and have told us about how the president was popular among women and minorities. But I think one of the most revealing statistics from those exit polls surely had to be the impact that young people had on this election. All totaled, Governor Romney actually collected 1.8 million more votes than the president if you count only those who are 30 and older. But among voters under the age of 30, President Obama collected 5.1 million votes, more than Romney. Now, that's a net positive of 3.3 million votes, which is huge when you consider that Romney only lost the popular vote by about 3 million people. Now, as with any election, there were a lot of factors at play. The Latino vote was huge for the president. Hurricane Sandy even had an impact, as I covered on a recent Trumpet Daily. But among these factors that favored President Obama, you can add to these that he could not have won a second term without gaining 60% of the vote among young people. Now, the obvious irony here is that it's the young people who have more to lose from an agenda that's more socialist in its nature. For example, by the end of the president's second term, he's projected, this is his own projection, that the national debt is going to be over $20 trillion. Now, the other side hasn't exactly been thrifty with their spending either. But who's going to be responsible for paying down that debt if you go far enough down the road? Well, of course, it's the next generation or the generation after that. And then what about all the entitlements that this massive, bloated government has promised oncoming generations? Unless there's some serious entitlement reform, by the time these young people who turned out in droves to vote for President Obama and his agenda, by the time they're middle-aged, by the time they're elderly, there's not going to be anything left for them, no benefits left. I just want to give you a quote from Rob Morley's article at thetrumpet.com. He wrote this last week. This was the day after the presidential election. He said at the Trumpet site, the U.S. federal government now funds 79 welfare programs. 79. 11 programs just for housing assistance, 12 for social services, 3 for energy and utility assistance, 12 for food aid, 12 for various education assistance, on top of 9 for vocational training, 3 for child care and child development, 7 for medical assistance, and 10 providing cash assistance. Add to that a myriad of welfare-type programs at the local, city, and county levels. The total price tag for just federal and state welfare programs came to almost $1 trillion in 2011, according to the Heritage Foundation. He said, so almost a third of America's yearly budget now goes to welfare. Mr. Morley concludes here, there's no easy fix. In fact, there may be no fix at all. About 1 in 3 Americans get some sort of government handout. Politicians can cut spending, but not without massively damaging the economy. The economy is addicted to government spending. There are whole industries that cater to welfare dependency. Go cold turkey, he writes, and the president can expect massive economic, if not social, upheaval. That's going to impact the youths in our society. Many young people simply do not want to hear about working hard in a free market society. They just don't want a government that's fiscally conservative or one that saves for the future. So many of them, like many adults in fact too, so many of them just want all of the free stuff that big government is out there promising. Last year there was a Pew survey that found that 49% of young Americans from the ages of 18 to 29, this is the same bracket that turned out in droves for President Obama on Election Day, 49% of them had a favorable view of socialism, of all things. Socialism. And only 43% had a negative view. So among young people in the United States, there's more of them who like socialism than who dislike it. More of them who favor socialism than capitalism. Now, 20 months before that poll was taken, those numbers were flipped. It was 43% that favored it and 49% that didn't like it. And just in less than 2 years, we see the fruits of this left-wing education. So many of these young people coming out of colleges and such, and they're taught there these socialist principles that they now favor in big government. Just 2 years, and you see a 12-point swing in favor of socialism in the United States. Now, is it any wonder that the United States is taking such a radical turn away from its founding principles? Or for that matter, is it any wonder why we as a society have drifted so far from God and so far from the Bible? Let's look at Matthew chapter 12 here to begin with. We'll hit a few scriptures here today. Now, commentators on the right, in that week following the election, it was interesting to watch because so many of them were dejected in a state of despair, and they were talking all week about how conservatism needs to be making more inroads into the university or in popular culture or maybe in the newsroom. They talked about needing leaders, teachers, journalists who could clearly and powerfully articulate the conservative agenda. And, while some of that may be good, is that really going to solve the problems that we see in education? Is it going to solve the problems that we see among young people? The reason conservatism is losing the battle for our schools and for the popular culture is because of the breakdown of the family. So many of these young people, they don't have a solid family upbringing. Many of them don't have fathers. And so they turn to other things. They turn to other groups. They turn to other parties for that fatherly direction. Look at Matthew 12 here in verse 25. It says, "And Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand." Jesus is saying here that division, whether you see it in the nation or division if you see it in the family, it leads to desolation. That's Jesus' words, not mine. That's what Christ said would happen. In America, we celebrate division, really. We talk about how democracy allows both sides to speak, and you just see the rising level of hatred as we draw closer to the end of this age, just as other prophecies have predicted. We see hatred, we see division, variance, strife. Division, though, leads to desolation. According to Thayer's lexicon, that word for desolation, it means to lay waste, to ruin, to reduce to nothing. Well, we've got some of our enemy nations, like Iran, that look at how much we spend on our elections, $6 billion, that just laugh at that. And look at what it produces. We go through 2 years of campaigning, and what are we left with after $6 billion? Pretty much the status quo, the same old, same old. And in this case, young people really spearheading this agenda that caters to minorities, that caters to illegals, that caters to the youth right now. But long term, well, it's like waiting for a train wreck. But Jesus said here, look, you can celebrate division if you like, but what will it lead to ultimately? He said ultimately it gets so bad that it leaves everything desolate. If we're divided against ourselves, then we're all coming to desolation. It doesn't matter which side of the political equation we're on. And if you really are serious about doing something dramatic to solve the problems that we see, you've got to go back to the cause, the core. And that, of course, is the family. We're facing the greatest danger that this country, America, that this country has ever faced. And even though we have enemies all around us on the outside, this great danger is caused primarily because of the bitter division from within. That's where we see America rotting. It's from the inside. That's where the real problem is. Let me quote to you from The Missing Dimension in Sex. This is a quote from Herbert W. Armstrong. He wrote back in the 1960s, 50 years ago. He said, "Since it is a basic truism that a solid family structure is the foundational bulwark of any stable and permanent society, this fact means only one thing. Civilization as we know it is on the way down and out, unless that great unseen strong hand from someplace soon intervenes and saves today's sick society." Now let's turn over to Isaiah chapter 3. We'll go over to the Old Testament here. As Mr. Armstrong brings out there, civilization as we know it is on the way down and out. Surely you can see that. Surely you can see that. I mean, you can see it by just looking at the younger generation. Look at what's happening to our youths. This is Isaiah 3 and verse 1. It says, "For behold, the Lord of hosts, does take away from Jerusalem and Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, and the whole stay of water, the mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet and the prudent and the ancient, the captain of 50, the honorable man, the counselor," it says, "and the cunning artificer and the eloquent orator." The days of strong leaders have long since gone. I mean, just look at how Western leadership has deteriorated just since the early 90s, just since when these youths were not even born, or about when they were born. I mean, things have changed just in the last couple decades. And look at where Satan has attacked our society the most, aiming at leadership ultimately, but he starts with the family. Verse 4 continues, "And I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them." That's Isaiah 3 and verse 4. Now, we've often said here that this verse doesn't necessarily mean that actual children will be grabbing hold of the reins. It means that adults will rule like children. But at the same time, in looking at these exit polls from this past election, you can also see how much power the youth have in our society today. You can see how much they're driving. They're the driving force behind so many things that we see in America. Few people stop to realize to what extent the teenagers have taken over. This is what Mr. Armstrong wrote back in 1964. They pretty well dominate the world picture. As I say, that was from 1964, 50 years ago. Verse 5 here in Isaiah continues, "And the people shall be oppressed every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable." Now that's the world we live in. That describes our society better than just about any commentator you've ever heard. Children who don't honor their elders. There's a verse in Leviticus that says, "You shall rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man and fear your God. I am the Lord," it says. Do you see that from the young generation today? Giving that kind of honor and respect to their elders? You don't see that kind of honor. You don't see that kind of respect coming from most young people today. Rather, you see disrespect. You see rebellion, a rebellious spirit. And you see more and more young people who are lazy, who want handouts, who want to be told how good they are, who never want to be corrected or instructed. Verse 9 goes and says, really what the problem is here. "The show of their countenance does witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves." See, here's our problems, and it starts in the home, like I said. They declare their sin, just like in Sodom, which I think we all remember what happened to that city. Today, there's no shame. There's no shame. Anything goes. Everything's accepted. Verse 12, it says, "As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they which lead you cause you to err and to destroy the way of your paths." That word oppressors there means to harass or to tyrannize. Children oppress, it says in Isaiah 3. Women rule. And the fathers, well, they're not even mentioned. Doesn't that just about sum up what you see in society today? And yet Republicans or conservatives think that we can turn all of this around if we just get a few more conservative professors at the university or a few more films made by Republicans. The problems society-wide are only going to worsen because the family is broken. The family's divided, and division in the family and division in the nation leads to desolation. That's what Jesus Christ said. America has about 75 million children under the age of 18. That makes up almost 25% of our overall population. And in a godly society, we would be greatly encouraged and uplifted by a statistic such as that. God's always intended for children to be a great blessing to their parents and to the community. The Psalms talk about children being olive plants around the table. That's in Psalm 128:3. God intended for our children to be a great blessing, not just to the family at home, but to society. So many parents today, though, they don't even want to go home at night or be with their children during the day. They just all go their separate ways. That's assuming they even stay together. Divorce, of course, rips apart families to where you don't even see your parents in so many cases. But you look at the way God set up the family in the Bible, the way He spells it out, and it's a great blessing if it's done God's way. Proverbs 20 and verse 29 says, "The glory of young men is their strength." The Proverbs, other scriptures in the Bible, speak of the great impact that young people can have and should have on society. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12, Paul said, "Let no man despise your youth, but be you an example to the believers." This is Paul writing to Timothy, his young assistant. He said, "Be an example to the believers." How? In word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity. You think a message like that would fly with the average university schoolroom today? That's the way God said it should be. If those youths, those young people today are brought up in a God-fearing society, in a God-fearing home, in a God-fearing nation where the family unit is strong and stable. But that is not the society that we live in today. We live, the Bible says, prophecy proves, we live in the latter days when prophecy says our young people will actually be a great burden to society. I just read it to you in Isaiah 3. Instead of helping to build it up, our own children are helping to tear it down. Now the cause goes back to their parents and the parents before them. And next time I'd like to cover a few scriptures that tell us how to grow up and how to help our children to grow up and to mature in their thinking. That's something we all need, not just the youths, but we adults as well. So you can be looking for that follow-up program on the Trumpet Daily page at thetrumpet.com. We'll have that up in the next day or two. In the meantime, go to the website, download our free booklet, Conspiracy Against Fatherhood. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.